Yeah, as said, I am Joshua. Maybe I'm rebranding myself. That's how we're doing it. So I've spent the last 10 years, a little bit of me, I spent the last 10 years working specifically in job advertising. So I'm very niche there. The best part of the last 2 years, I've been at IBM, so responsible for their global job advertising strategy in the COE team, which is a very interesting position. And then I've now taken perhaps the crazy decision to take a little bit of time out of work. So my wife is due in the next 2 weeks, my second child. Taking a few months out, but if my phone rings in the middle of this and I run out the door, it's for a good reason, I promise you, okay? So some of the things I want to talk to you about today. So I want to do some conversation around programmatic advertising. I think something we hear a lot, and the more people I speak to don't seem to actually know what it means. So I'm going to do a really basic intro into that. A lot of this is going to be framed through my time at IBM, so a case study on how we move to a more agile approach to advertising. Then we've got how to optimize your job adverts to increase conversions, and finally a little bit on ROI, which is one of the themes that I've seen coming through the day. Put your hand up. Does anyone know what this word means? Pronounced iatrogenesis. Anyone ever heard of this? Good. The only people I've ever known that know this word are Greek, because that's where its origin comes from. So what if I told you it was the third leading cause of death in the United States in 2018, 2019? Sounds like a pretty terrible disease, right? Well, actually, it's death as the result of medical error, okay? So a doctor made a mistake and that resulted in death. But what do they write on the death certificate? They write iatrogenesis. So sorry this is a bit morbid, but there is a point to it, right? What I think we're all thinking here is they're being a little bit kind of ambiguous there, right? They don't really want you to look too much into it. And I think that's kind of what we do with the word programmatic. We're using almost like an overly complicated word to describe something that at its essence is pretty simple. So if we were to say instead programmatic advertising is the use of technology for media buying, it's more of a kind of approach to how we're going to do things, particularly pay performance. But I'm going to jump into that in a little bit more detail. So when I look at programmatic advertising, so I try and really simplify it, particularly when I was talking to people internally, and I tried to simplify it into active and passive, okay? So active, really simple, those are people that are looking for jobs today. Passive, people, not necessarily when we're talking about sourcing and finding your needle in a haystack, we're talking about people that are looking for jobs maybe in 6 to 12 months' time, so they're not quite ready yet. So in terms of the tactics, when we talk specifically about programmatic, we're talking pay per performance in terms of job boards. And things like Google keyword sponsoring, which is super simple, sponsoring the keywords, developer jobs in London, right? And then we look at more of the creative stuff, more of the stuff that you might use with your employer branding, so display ads, pre-roll video, that kind of stuff, right? And I think that passive side is probably what we're more familiar with on a day-to-day basis. We are bombarded with programmatic advertising, right? It's that kind of advertising that comes up and you think, how do they know me so well? So to take that example we've got here, I use this pet one, and that top left corner, it says, I love downward dog just as much as you. They've probably looked at a demographic of certain people in a certain age range that do yoga, and they're trying to target them with getting a dog, right? And before you know it, you're ordering one off the internet, if you can do that for dogs. I'm not sure you can. But what do you need to know in order to do that? Well, there's some bits that actually sit behind the machine, I guess, when you're looking at that. So there's a lot of areas that you should be looking at. You should be doing persona mapping, prioritizing your lists of roles, making sure that you've got sufficient content. And when we were looking at programmatic at IBM, there was two really big problems we had with this kind of passive, particularly when we were looking kind of midway through last year. And that was forecasting. We were really lucky if we could get forecasts in 6 to 12 days in advance, let alone 6 to 12 months, right? So it becomes very hard to tackle that passive audience base when you don't really know what's coming. So I think it was Claire that mentioned from Prestige mentioned, sometimes you just got to start with something. And we looked at, okay, well, could we do active programmatic? What do we need for that? You need a job advert. That seemed to me like a much more simpler place to start. So the kind of pitch that I was doing when we was talking about this internally was, let's learn to walk before we try and run. And the absolute goal that we wanted to move towards, and I think everyone should be moving towards, is how can we get further along that passive line, right? But it doesn't have to be all or nothing. You can start on the active and move across and phase that. You don't have to be 100% one or the other. And that for us was the place to start. So programmatic advertising for active candidates. Now, I don't want to patronize you too much, but I'm just going to explain this. There is method to it, I promise you. So we have some different ways that you can advertise jobs, okay? Credit or duration-based, your total jobs, your CV library, your read.co.uk's, where you pay for a job and it goes live for 4 to 6 weeks. We've got slot-based boards. I don't know if you've heard this place called LinkedIn, but you're able to advertise using slots on there. There's two great things about those methods, right? And that is whether you get 50 candidates or you get 5,000 candidates, you pay the same for your credit or for your slot. And then the whole market was disrupted by Indeed, and we started moving towards this kind of CPC, so cost per click or cost per apply, which is what they're further going down now type model. So I call this kind of the pay per performance model. Again, you're paying for outcomes, you're paying for clicks, or you're paying for applications. So where does programmatic come into that mix? Well, if we reframed in this scenario, programmatic is just pay per performance at scale. So you usually need a vendor, and they've all got their own proprietary technology and their own budget management and AI that they work with, and this works across the same on all programmatic. But if we take job boards, because it's really simple, what we're saying is if you've got £1,000 to sponsor a job, rather than just putting that £1,000 in an Indeed-shaped basket, instead what we're saying is we're going to let the technology decide what channels it should be spent on. So there are literally thousands of these pay-per-performance job boards, and even today, your more traditional ones like your Read and Total Jobs CV Library, they're more open to this way of working. And we're letting the technology decide if Indeed is the right place to pay for that, pay Indeed for it. But if we can get the candidates from cheaper elsewhere, let's use the budget more efficiently. That's what you're using the technology to do. So about halfway through last year, we really got our in at IBM to start doing this more. And it isn't the in that you would normally think. Our hiring demand dramatically decreased. Now, why was this the opening that I was looking for? Well, we spend literally millions on duration-based and slot-based advertising all over the world. And about halfway through the year, I don't know if you've heard anything about this, but tech hiring wasn't necessarily a great place to be. So we had a lot of projects, a lot of things that meant that markets that we had already invested in, we had to shift. And we had hundreds of thousands, if not over a million's worth of inventory in all of these duration-based and these slot-based job boards that we could no longer use. We didn't have the jobs to fill them. So we had some painful times trying to renegotiate rollovers and all this kind of stuff. So I said, okay, well, moving forward into next year, why don't we look at what I would frame as an agile approach to advertising? This worked really well, okay, because IBM's an agile business, and that's the methodology that they look to go through. And here's what I was saying was, if you look at this pay-per-performance job advertising, it's really simple. And to explain it in the most simple way I can think of, I was saying to the business, it's like turning on the tap. When we need more candidates, we turn the tap on. When we don't need them anymore, we turn the tap off. But why this was really impactful was because it meant that we could be agile and we could move. So if in January our demand was in the US, no problem, we'll put the money there. If we have a big need in Israel, and it's not for developers anymore, it's for salespeople, no problem, we route the money somewhere else. We can be agile to whatever situation comes our way. So the same way that I had that kind of move to active to passive, this is what we were working towards in IBM, and what they're continuing to work towards now, which is moving from that kind of duration-based to performance-based. Maybe they don't always get the line all the way across. We're going to let the data help us to decide that. But again, it should be a phased approach. Keep dipping your toe in the water, keep finding results, and then keep working through. So now let's imagine that we've got budget. I think all of you at least would advertise on job boards. All of this is running for this. I wanted to give you some tips that I rolled out. So being at IBM, there was a huge amount of scale. We had 2,000 recruiters. We had 4.2 million applications a year, 70,000 hires. So I had to try and get some kind of simple principles and guidelines that we could go out and follow. So the first one, and I've just taken a kind of classic recruitment funnel here, one that I'm passionate about and I don't think gets enough attention is awareness. I hear a lot of talk around when job adverts doing things like copywriting, all this kind of stuff. Definitely important, but if no one ever finds your job, they don't get to see the great copywriting, the employer brand, all the stuff that we're here today to look at. So how can you go out and increase some of that awareness with job titles? So think about what a candidate who's active is looking for. 3 things usually. They're looking at job titles, they're looking at locations, and they're looking at salaries. And usually the external job title is probably the one we have the most influence over. So based on some Appcast data, what they were able to show across 1.2 million applications is 1 to 3 words fits best. Beyond 6, you're starting to get yourself into a place where you're going to be performing perhaps not as well as you'd like. Bonus points, particularly if you're using a cost per click model. So 35 characters or less. The reason being, on a mobile phone, beyond 35 characters, you can't see the full job title. So you could be paying for clicks on candidates that are just literally clicking to see the full job title that your role has. So here's an example title. I always just say, write a job title like you would explain it to your parents, okay? No one's going to go in a dinner party and they say, what do you do? And I say, I'm a senior software engineer, cloud team, back-end consultant, Midwest. They're going to look at you like you're crazy, right? Just think about how people search. And I've found that recruiters' intuition on this is actually normally pretty good. But intuition only gets you so far. So one of the biggest wins we had when I was at IBM was using data. So I've put in two free really good resources, so Indeed Hiring Insights and Google Trends. And the reason we use these for job titles is they can actually tell you what the most searched titles are and give you comparisons, right? So when you have two people with opinions, which might be you and a hiring manager, we all know here, right, hiring managers can be very opinionated on what they think the job should be. But if you're going in and saying, based on market data from Indeed and Google, I can tell you that statistically this is the best job title we're going to use, now you're the one coming in with a much more convincing argument. So this really helped us to break down some of those horrible, archaic job titles. I'll give you a good example. We had about 3,000 live roles at any one time with the job title application developer. And through doing this, we found that actually software developer was a better term. So it wasn't making a massive difference on a per job level, but you times that by 3,000, we were able to really increase the views and the hits that we were getting for all of those jobs. So the next part I wanted to talk about, so we've got the awareness stage. How do we start converting these into applications, right? So I want to do a really quick question for you. I've got 2 job adverts here. They're for a QA tester role. You don't need to know what it is. All I want you to do is have a quick skim read of these for 30 seconds, okay? Okay, so as a show of hands, which role would you think you would be more likely to apply for? So can you put hands up for advert A? Okay. And then we've got advert B. There we go, we've got 1 or 2 people in it. And pretty much, and I've done a lot of sessions on this at IBM as well, about 90% of the room usually goes for advert A. That's what I found. Now, when I was presented this in IBM, the next thing I would say is, congratulations, you all want to apply for a job at Oracle, right? So this was a really good way for me to explain to them that the structure of a job advert does actually really make a difference to what a candidate is thinking. So why did you perhaps as a room prefer advert A to advert B? The first thing is be concise, right? So it should be an advert and it should have all of your employer language through it. It should be a mirror and it should tie up to everything that you're doing across the rest of the business. The use of we and you statements. So this is basic psychology, but write to the candidate as if they've already got the job, okay? Really important to help them envisage themselves working for you. Textio, everyone always panics when I tell them this one. Textio research shows that an optimum length is between 300 to 660 words. Indeed say 1,000 characters. That's about the same. Don't worry, the first time I had this conversation with Indeed, 100% of our jobs were over 1,000 characters, all right? So we had a little bit to work to do on that. But generally speaking, being more concise is really going to help you. Strive to keep the language as neutral as possible. Don't make your adverts stale, but try not to make them overly masculine, overly feminine. I've put a link to another free resource in there, which is just a free gender decoder tool, which is something you can look at. But if you are really, for me personally, when I'm talking about diversity, I'm much more passionate about this point, which is use no more than 5 bullet points or 5 consecutive bullet points for preferred and essential skills. There's 2 big reasons for this. First of all, so more masculine candidates tend to apply for jobs if they meet 60% of the criteria. More feminine candidates, and this is also true for underrepresented populations, tend to need to have 100%, okay? So by making this really long list of skills, what you're doing is probably the people you want to recruit the most, they're ruling themselves out incorrectly for applying for your job. The other thing that I think is really useful for is rather than going to a hiring manager and saying, what's the key skills for this position? It's a different question to say, what are the top 5 things you care about the most for this role? It actually helps you to understand what to prioritise and what to look for in the candidates as well. The next part, I call it amplifiers. I've put salary in there. Again, if you really care about diversity, salary range, and showing that you have salary transparency is probably one of the most important things you can do. The only reason I've put it as an amplifier is it's not the easiest thing in the world for most businesses to get on there. So if you can do it, 100% do it. The others as well, I think, are reasonably self-explanatory. But remember this, you could have the greatest advert in the world. If your apply process is terrible, you're still going to struggle to convert. That's the unfortunate truth. Okay, so for the final bit, I just then want to talk a little bit about how do you communicate ROI. And I think, Dave, when you were talking earlier, you were saying employer branding is sometimes this hard thing to make really tangible. So I want to try and give some examples on how I've done this in terms of job advertising, okay? So there's 3 metrics that I'm going to talk through today. So view to apply start rate, apply start to apply complete, and application to shortlist. Okay, so I'm going to talk through each one of these individually for you. The reason that I use these is, first of all, it helps to compare apples to apples. So you can use this across LinkedIn, you can use this across programmatic, you can use it across job boards, it doesn't really matter. It's putting them all into one same place so you can actually compare them. The second thing is, I use them as a way to identify like where are the bottlenecks that are in my process so I can actually use the data to try and improve. So let's start with view to apply start rate. So what does it mean? So it's the percentage of candidates who viewed your job on a platform that then went on to click apply, okay? So everyone can get this because any vendor that you work with stores this data themselves, okay? Now, what it doesn't necessarily mean, they might have clicked that apply now button, but they might not have completed on your ATS. We'll get to that in a moment. So what does this tell you? Well, actually what it tells you is, are our adverts doing a good job of converting candidates? The higher the number, the better you are at doing it. So a story on this, with LinkedIn when I was at IBM, on Talent Insights, you can actually draw up a list of your competitors and you can see what their view to apply start conversion is. So I got Microsoft, AWS, all these businesses that we compete with, and they were at about 15.4%. We were at 10.9%. And that was a really powerful way for me to be able to go back to the company and say, look, we are doing a worse job than our competitors at this. This is why you need to follow my guidelines. This is why you need to follow our templates. This is why you need to follow our branding, okay? Next, we've got apply start to apply complete rate. This is the percentage of candidates that land on your careers website that go through the hoops in order to land in your ATS, okay? So if you go and actually look through this, this is a really, really general rule, but at least try and make sure it's under 10 minutes. It's the most blanket advice that I can give on it. And I think this is pretty obvious, but it's telling you, is your career site architecture and is your application system, your applicant tracking system helping or hindering your ability to convert candidates? Look at your own data, see how it works. And here's the thing, if you don't know, then a good rule of thumb is try and work on keep on improving it. I don't know anyone that's had a good application process by accident, okay? So keep working on it, keep trying to improve month on month. And then finally, application to shortlist rate. I think this should be, again, reasonably easy to understand, but what we're doing here is we're looking at quality. I've had some businesses that actually first interview is a better proxy for this. I'm not too passionate about that either way, but when we was at IBM, we looked at shortlist. The reason we did that is for our business, we knew that if a candidate was shortlisted for a vacancy, they were a good fit for the job, okay? There's 100 different reasons why that candidate might not get hired or might not choose to join your business. But what we do know is over time, the more shortlisted candidates we get, statistically, the more likely we're going to be to make hires in the long term. Okay, so I just want you to do 2 more final thoughts. I've given some ideas on what you can look at in order to start measuring data or like principles. I just wanted to give you an example of like how we might go and actually present some of these types of data. So another thing that I was responsible for was there was this metric that we was always looking at. We called it always on marketing. But what we thought as a talent marketing team was if we're increasing our job views month on month, year on year, quarter on quarter, then we generally know that we are doing a better job as a whole, as a marketing function, right? More people are finding our jobs. But before when I came in, so we're looking at the career site specifically here, these are the kinds of things that were being presented. We were literally just taking stats. So we were saying, and by the way, the numbers were much bigger than this. They're probably in the millions. I've taken out the numbers or used fake numbers so we could just kind of illustrate the point. But let's say we had this, and this is kind of rings true. In May 22, we had 24,000 clicks, and everyone would look at it and go, oh no, we've gone down. So what's the problem here? Why are we going down year on year? Well, what we're missing in this is the context. Actually, we might have had less jobs year on year. And when you put that context in, actually, we are getting more clicks per job than we were in 2022. So that's why the context is really important. And then what I found is the more senior the people it was that I was speaking to, really, they don't need this level of detail. And really, the big thing that they care about is what's the percentage change? So I would do something that was a one line like this. Despite a fall in hiring demand, we have grown our number of views per job by 22% year on year. Everyone's happy, they've ticked the box, everything's going as it should do. So in reality, 22% just sounds nicer than 28.4 to 34.7. It's just a little bit more easy to understand. And then the final thing I just wanted to talk about was with job advertising. When I joined IBM, and I bet everyone's had this, I had the question of, hey Josh, we want to get less applications per job from our job boards, but we want them to be better quality. And I'm like, okay, that's pretty much like the impossible task that we're going in. So I'm waiting for this to take off. I'm calling it the Bon Jovi principle, which is effectively any candidate that applies for a job, they're bought into two things, right? They're bought into your business, and then they're bought into the role they're applying for. But they still exist after that, and they're still bought into your business. So that candidate is halfway there, okay? Now, we've got hundreds and hundreds of different ways through job alerts, through ongoing marketing, through sourcing, through emailing, that we can do something with that candidate afterwards. So sometimes I think we need to remember that all of this advertising we're doing, from employer branding to job advertising to everything, is about generating more candidates that you own so you can do more with them in the future and become more self-reliant. So those are the things that I wanted to run through. Hopefully I covered all of those. I've put a big QR code up with my LinkedIn profile if you want to connect with me. Thank you very much.